harbor and a historic one. The Civil War began here with the shelling of Fort Sumter, and even before the fleet was beaten back at the harbor entrance by American Revolutionary troops. But there is another history here, and it has its own kind of troops. 2 boatloads of them once starved themselves to death in this harbor rather than enter Charleston. Another 40,000 of them were rushed through this port in one 3-year period so they could go to work in America for nothing. They were Africans, but in this country they were taught to look at themselves another way, as slaves. Charleston is one of America's oldest cities. Much of the city is lovely, and much of its loveliness is the product of slave labor. But Charleston, like the rest of America, learned very early that if it was going to have slaves, it had better sleep with a gun under its pillow. Like other immigrants to America, the slaves were huddled masses, but unlike the others, what blacks were huddled against was America itself. Often they rebelled, quite often. Partly in order to deal with inside agitators, Charleston put walls and fences all over the place. It turned out that if you bought a slave, you may have bought yourself an insurrectionist. Today, all over America, there are still echoes of the noises made when one race tries to subjugate another. We will explore the heritage of slavery and the roots of black rebellion. 20 Africans were landed in America in 1619, 1 year before the Mayflower. By 1860, there were 4 million black men, women, and children, the private property of white America. The New World meant possession to the white man. It meant dispossession to the black man. Slavery was an attitude as much as a condition, and attitudes, like land, can be inherited. On the plantation outside Charleston, where his family has lived for 8 generations since 1672, Norwood Hasty was asked if he thinks slavery was immoral.
No, I don't. Because when a slave came from Africa, he couldn't speak the language. He was totally untrained to do any job at all that would fit in with the civilization. Someone had to take care of him. Someone had to take care of him 24 hours a day. And it's pretty hard to do that unless you owned a person. So I think slavery just had to be in those early days.
Mr. Hasty, what was life like in those early days?
As far as the colored people were concerned, I feel that they were a good bit happier than they are now. They had less in the way of material things. But I can remember back in the 20s, when I was a small boy, they were always singing at their work. They had a great sense of humor. And now today, they just don't seem to care much about that as they used to. And I think they've lost their sense of humor somewhat, which I deplore.
What do you think are the differences between the races?
I think there's a refusal to accept responsibility. I think there's a lack of motivation. I've tried here to promote people to foremen, superintendents, but they just refuse to do it. They just don't want the responsibility. They don't worry like the white man. If they have troubles, they go to sleep and wake up the next morning, and that trouble is over.
Is it possible that white people have something to do with the lack of ability for blacks to assimilate into this culture?
Absolutely. The white man has certainly been prejudiced and to quite an extent unfair. But customs die awful hard. It takes a long time, and everyone knew years ago that the Negro would have to be given equality. But in the South, knowing Negroes as we think we do, we realized it would take time. It's been compared to straightening teeth. It takes a slow, steady pressure. You can't do it with a hammer. And white people's attitudes will change in time. I'm a lot more liberal than I was 5 years ago, and I know I'll be a lot more liberal 5 years from now, and I think almost everyone else is in that category.
What has tended to make you more liberal?
Well, realization that the Negro is a human being like anyone else.
Mr. Hasty, what did you think we were before you began to think of us as human beings?
Well, in a way, we thought of you almost as a very superior pet. Something, or rather someone, we had to take care of, because we had to do so much of their thinking for them. We had to do almost everything for them except living their own lives. Anything outside, we had to do for them.
If masters did the thinking for slaves, it is not recorded who did the thinking for masters. Most Southerners didn't even own slaves, but they became victims of the glamour surrounding big plantations. Today, there is talk of equality in the future, but it is the romance of the unequal past that still infatuates and torments much of Charleston. For blacks, that past is a little thin on romance. It is true that in a home like this one, Scarlett O'Hara might have lived. And a home like this might have contained an overseer like Simon Legree. But it is an absolute certainty that if I had been around in those days, I would have lived right here. And that, for an increasing number of black Americans today, is what American history is all about. The process of slavery began in Africa. The slave trade was very rewarding. New Englanders made quick fortunes, and African profiteers who were not exactly soul brothers sometimes helped them. A black captive was marched overland to the west coast of Africa, where a molten branding iron gave him a new, instant identity. It was found that if you strip a man of his culture, prevent him from learning a new one, and separate him from his family, it does not take him too long to start feeling like a commodity. The West's naval architects competed to design slave ships where more men could be packed into less space. Gustavus Vasa was a slave who later bought his freedom. A reading from his diary recalls his abduction in 1756.
The sight of the ship filled me with terror when I was carried on board. I was put down under the decks, and there, with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat. 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands while the other flogged me severely. The closeness of the place and the heat added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. The air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered a scene of horror almost unbelievable.
When they reached America, slaves found auction blocks waiting for them. Any slave could be sold at any time. Slave markets were very effective socially. They broke up the black family. But even if you were a commodity, you remembered the last time you saw your mother. A slave described his own sale in 1858.
My brothers and sisters were bid off first, while my mother, paralyzed by grief, held me by the hand. Her turn came, and she was bought by Isaac Riley. Then I was offered to the assembly of purchasers. My mother pushed through the crowd to the spot where Riley was standing. She fell at his feet, entreating him to buy her baby as well as herself and spare her one child at least. Can it be believed that this man was capable of disengaging himself from her with such violent blows and kicks as to reduce her to creeping out of his reach? I was then 5 years old.
Slaves were sold at several markets in Charleston, and one of them has been meticulously preserved for visitors. Recently, a biracial committee was formed, and it has worked hard to build a new link between whites and blacks. Very little of what American cities have come to think of as racial turmoil has occurred in Charleston. But underneath the graciousness, old relationships are often found intact. Descendants of slaves work for descendants of slave owners. Mrs. Lionel Legg retains the tone of a past she cherishes.
So Daisy was my little playmate, my maid, my friend, and the daughter of old Catherine, who was a cook that we adored. And so all those years, we played together, and everyone was happy. We never heard of all these things that we hear about today. And there were nearly 100 enormous rice plantation with many animals around and a beautiful old house and about 100 colored people there. But we loved them. They were our friends. And then it's no disgrace to say they're like children. When we say that, it's because they are like happy children, some of them. Because they like to sit in the sun and rather than work hard. And they'd rather play than work.
If you could, would you paint a picture for us of what it was like on the plantation in your early days?
It was a lovely, happy time living in open spaces with many lovely colored people and animals and flowers and fields. My father had everything thoroughbred, from the pigs, horses, the dogs, and the people had to be thoroughbred. And we would get into a buggy with him and drive to the plantation from what we call the pine land where we lived. And we would spend, every Saturday this was, and we would spend the day in old Fortune, I can see him now, would give us dinner, and we would have a heavenly time. And old April, he was the dairyman. That's all he did. All he did was to skim the cream over these great big bowls of clabber and put them in the wooden churn and churn this marvelous fresh butter. That was April's job. He didn't do anything else but love us and skim the cream.
The Southern white man just loves to say that, oh, our Negroes are happy. They like it. They like the way things are. If other people would just leave them alone, there wouldn't be any problem. And some, I think, really believed it. And I think that that's one thing perhaps that sort of thrown them off balance when all of a sudden their Negroes just weren't behaving the way they thought they ought to behave. You were just a doormat. And that's where the good relations came in. As long as you're a doormat, we have wonderful relations. They just felt that until recently, relations between Negroes and white were just so very good. Just wonderful relations. It's outside agitators. And yet, it never occurs to them that they were good on whose terms? On their terms.
Those terms have been dictated by a white aristocracy that has ruled the South for almost 300 years. The aristocrats said slavery was one of mankind's noblest inventions, but it was a nobility often maintained by violence. If a slave got beaten enough, some of the milk of human kindness was likely to drain out of him.
The master got mad at me, and he buckled me down across a barrel and whipped me till he cut the blood out of me. It felt like I would die. But he owned us body and soul, and there wasn't anything we could do about it. When the master died, we were called in to look at his coffin. We all marched by him slowly, and I just happened to look up and caught my sister's eye, and we both just naturally laughed. Why not? We were glad he was dead.
Slaves began running away in the 1600s, but the principal method of escape wasn't formed until the 1800s. It was called the Underground Railroad, though the journey was usually on foot. Harriet Tubman, the railroad's outstanding conductor, would walk innocently past a plantation, singing "Steal Away to Jesus," and the slaves would literally steal away to Philadelphia or Boston. Wherever there was slavery, there was also resistance. The revolutionary movement among blacks began long before the Spirit of '76. Until 1800, slavery was legal in the North. New York City had a massive slave insurrection in 1712. There were at least 250 recorded slave revolts in America. The most effective insurrection was led by Nat Turner in Virginia in 1831. Turner and his fellow revolutionaries killed 60 white people before they themselves were captured and executed by state and federal troops. The South was terrified. Owners decided they had better be protected from their property. Slave laws became more severe. In 1850, Congress lent the South a hand by passing the Fugitive Slave Law, allowing Southerners to come north to reclaim their runaways. But resistance had its own momentum, too. It was articulated fiercely and with finality in the famous appeal by David Walker, a free black man living in the North.
I ask one question here. Can our condition be any worse? Had you not rather be killed than to be a slave to a tyrant who takes the life of your mother, wife, and dear little children? I speak, Americans, for your own good. We must and shall be free in spite of you. You may do your best to keep us in wretchedness and misery, but God will deliver us from under you. And woe, woe will it be unto you if we have to obtain our freedom by fighting. Throw away your fears and prejudices, and we will love you more than we do now hate you. What a happy country this will be if the whites will only listen.
On the site of an old church in Charleston, the most daring of all slave revolt was planned by a freed slave named Denmark Vesey. With 9,000 supporters, Vesey intended to capture the entire city of Charleston, but he was betrayed by a house slave. The Reverend Henry Butler inspires his congregation to be proud that slavery was met by insurrection.
So Denmark Vesey, an anti-slavery leader, 1767, 1822. He was an insurrectionist, so they tell me. He organized an unsuccessful slave revolt here in Charleston, South Carolina. He and 34 other Negro conspirators, so they call them, were hanged. But it was here on this spot in a little old wooden structure downstairs that Denmark Vesey planned his insurrection. And then as now, some of the people could not keep a secret, and I can sympathize because our forefathers were taught not to keep anything secret from the master. And there was a servant who told the master of Denmark Vesey's insurrection and of his plan. And of course the plans were broken up. And then South Carolina passed a law closing all schools and daring Negroes to be caught reading, and this place was closed. When we think of those that were hanged, those that were persecuted, those that were killed, those that have had hose and water poured on them, those that have had bloodhounds on their trail, those that have been mistreated, and in the midst of it all, somehow they stood up because they had a spiritual backbone that caused them to look beyond the temporary things of life. If we are to move in this new day, we cannot have backbones like a jellyfish. What is man? Man is a part of God. Each man is a thought of God. Each man is entitled to be recognized, and we trust that in the future we will not have to do what our fathers had to do, but if necessary, we have to do what is to be done.
Doing what he thinks must be done in Charleston is what Bill Saunders, a black activist, worries about. He finds the past too close for comfort. Although it is more than 100 years since the end of legal slavery in America, Saunders believes too many whites act like masters and too many blacks feel like slaves.
Old slave master and slave condition that existed 100, 200 years ago is still here in Charleston. We, as black people, were brought into this country for slave labor, and we have worked as slaves from the time that we were brought into this country until the present time. I'm fighting so hard for black survival because I believe that this country is getting to the place that they don't need that labor anymore. And since they don't need that labor anymore, they don't need black people anymore.
The past has taught me that I got to do something to survive here. And this, I feel like, a lot of us gonna have to start exactly how we feel about the situation. We really got nothing to lose, really. We ain't got no jobs to lose, we ain't got no business to lose. The only thing that we have got to lose our lives, the man been taking that anytime he wanted. The thing that I am saying, or that I am preaching, that instead of going to jail for the man all the time for nothing, if you're gonna go to jail, go to jail for something. Have yourself a plan and make something count when you do go to jail. This is the type of program, but you got to, the thing that we don't have no program to go to the man and say, this is what we want. But there's a lot of things in my past that I'm guilty of. First, my parents were black, and then I was born black. You're not guilty, of no crime at all except for being black. The white man is my oppressor. He's the one that controls the jail, he controls the hospital, he controls the army, he controls the Navy, he controls everything. And he's the man that I have to fight. White America's got to wake up and realize and listen and understand that not only black folks got to make sacrifices, but white folks gonna have to start making sacrifices. Some sacrifices to make this country what it's supposed to be. Other than that, there's not gonna be no country.